What's up, everybody? I am Emerald, and this is the Emerald Crusader live stream. Welcome back, and if you're new to the stream, happy Friday. I am so excited that it is Friday, as is Tug over here. Friday is always a great day of the week, but if you're new around here, Friday is a particularly good day on the stream because that is where we host the Chai Am I Reading This book club, where we drink chai tea, lattes, and talk about the book we've been reading. So, with that said, let's talk about a book. So the book that we've been reading is Stephen King's Salem's Lot, and we left off at the end of part 1, and we read through part 2 during this week. So, with that said, I'm gonna go over the plot and talk about the book. So if you haven't read this and you don't want it spoiled for you, leave now, because there's going to be a lot of spoilers that I'm going to talk about. But if you have been keeping up with the book or you've already read it, hang out and chat with me about it. So, the second part of the book picks up in chapter 8, following Ben kind of right where we left off, but instead of us following Matt, we're with Ben. So, Eva wakes up Ben and tells him that he has a phone call. She says it's Matt who asks him to come over at once and bring a cross or St. Christopher's medal. Ben doesn't have one, but he gets the crucifix from Eva, who is confused by the request. Ben finds Matt completely freaked out because of, the whole vampire thing. If you don't remember, part 1 left off with assumed vampire sucking on soon-to-become vampire Mike Ryerson, and Matt being scared to death in his room. So Matt brings Ben up to date on the whole goings on and what he thinks is happening in the town, and they go upstairs to look in on Mike, and Matt is still terrified, and he thinks that Mike is dead. Mike seems to be sleeping peacefully. However, the window is open, and Matt knows that he shut and locked the window. Also, there's a drop of blood on the covers, and Mike isn't breathing. The mark on his neck that he had before has disappeared as well. Matt points out that this is what happens with vampires, and he says they should have put a stake through Mike's heart, but Ben says that won't go over well with the authorities. Ben also says he believes Matt is not crazy, but everyone else will think he is if he starts talking about vampires in the town. Matt and Ben agree to call the doctor and the police, and then Parkins, the constable, and Jimmy Cody, Matt's doctor, comes out, and Jimmy confirms that Ryerson is dead. Parkins notices that the screen on Ryerson's window fell off and is in the grass outside. He goes on to do the paperwork, but he knows that something weird is up, and Matt and Ben decided to keep the vampire part to themselves, so he knows something's weird, but he's not letting on just yet. Matt and Ben recommit to going to the Marsden house. Ben says he'll get in touch with Susan, and Matt decides to ask the Undertaker if Danny Glick was in fact embalmed, because they believe it was Danny Glick that was sucking on Mike Ryerson. Back at the boarding house, Ben goes to sleep. He wakes up and things feel better and brighter, and he goes out planning to contact Susan and runs into Floyd Pivots. And Floyd is dressed in sunglasses and an overcoat, and out of nowhere just slugs him. And that's where the chapter ends, because we're following Ben and he loses consciousness. So the next chapter picks up right there with Susan, but first we have a big confrontation scene between Susan and her mother. Anne tells Susan about Mike Ryerson's death and implies that Ben was involved. Anne also tells Susan about Miranda's death, Ben's wife that died in the motorcycle accident. She learned about it through gossiping with her buddies, and she says that Ben was drunk even though he wasn't during the accident. Susan slaps her mom in the face and says that she's moving out. Mom says that Floyd came by crying, which Susan thinks is weird. Of course, it's a bit weird, we know now, because we find out later that he's becoming a vampire. Or at least it seems that way at the time. Eva Miller calls Susan to tell her that semi-vampire Floyd put Ben in the hospital. Whenever Floyd punched him, he fell back and hit his head on his car and got knocked out. Over at the hospital, Susan learns that Ben's okay, though they want to keep him overnight for observation. Susan goes in to see him, and Ben half-consciously tells her to see Matt and ask him to tell her everything. He also tells her to check and see if Matt knows Father Callahan. And he also, it's the first time he admits he loves her as well. So Susan goes to see Matt, who uncharacteristically is cautious when he lets Susan in. Usually he just yells from the door, "Come right in." Before Matt tells Susan the whole vampire deal going on in the town, he asks her to give her opinion on Straker, who she saw at the store. And so she just tells him how he was a very gentlemanly guy, very almost attractive in certain ways. He was very charming to all the women, and even brought out a piece of furniture that Susan assumed was about 300 pounds and set it down for who was it? Mabel Wirtz to sit in. But Susan also didn't like him for some reason. She was picking up on some vibes he was putting out that just she really didn't like. So Matt says that fits well with their whole theory, and then tells her the whole vampire deal going on that he thinks is happening between him and Ben. However, Susan isn't ready to believe vampires quite yet. Susan makes excuses like maybe Matt was asleep, or maybe he was dreaming, or something like that. Matt says vampires can only come in if invited, and remembering how he invited in Mike Ryerson the other night. Then Matt and Susan hear something upstairs, and Matt insists he is going to see what it is, and Susan tells Susan to keep talking as if he hasn't left. Matt goes upstairs and is completely terrified. He remembers walking home alone from Cub Scouts as a kid, and he remembers how scared of the dark he was then. And this is gonna kind of be a theme throughout the whole chapter, is just darkness and the inherent fear that almost all of us have of it. But this is the first little taste of that. Upstairs, Matt doesn't turn on the light, and he goes into the room. Mike Ryerson's body is laying there and suddenly sits up, exposing the stitches from where the coroner had done the autopsy earlier. Mike Ryerson tries to get Matt to look into his eyes and be hypnotized, but Matt breaks the glance and holds up the crucifix that he has. Matt revokes his invitation, and Mike Ryerson goes out the window, hurling some threats at the old man. Then Matt has a heart attack, and he yells to Susan downstairs to call his doctor, Jimmy Cody, which she does. Jimmy says to just wrap him up in a warm blanket and not to move him, and call an ambulance immediately, and he was on his way. Susan then goes back up the stairs to Matt, where she is just terrified, and even though she doesn't really believe in the whole vampire thing, it's just got a gut feeling that something's very bad there. And then she finds Mike Ryerson's class ring in the guest bedroom, which thoroughly terrifies her. And just for a second, she says that she believed in the vampires. But that's how we end the chapter there, and we go to another chapter about the lot. And this chapter is really where the theme of darkness is explored, and the difference between the fear of darkness, where you don't really know what's out there, and the fear of genuine evil in front of you. And it's a really good chapter. But chapter 10 starts out where we get some juicy details about the town's secrets. We found out that Hubie Marsden was in touch with Barlow, which is why Barlow is there at the current time. The fire in 1951 was deliberately set by the then class valedictorian for reasons that doesn't go into further. The Methodist minister, John Groggins, has sexy thoughts about his Bible class, and George Midler wears women's undergarments when he does certain things. But then the chapter picks up, and we're at the morgue, and Mike Ryerson sat up in the middle of his autopsy, which means that it's likely the coroner, Carl Foreman, is probably going to become a vampire. And also, Danny Glick sucked on the baby, Randy McDougal, and then shortly thereafter, Sally McDougal discovers that her baby is dead, and she was super upset about it. Even though she hit her baby earlier, it was a very, very strange scene tonally. And then we go to Marjorie Glick, and she is sick and having fantasies about Danny coming to her and sucking on her breasts. And it is pretty clear that her and Tony are on the way to becoming vampires. And then it's over to Susan, who's visiting Ben in the hospital. They argue about whether or not vampires can be real, and Ben says, look at the facts. Susan says, vampires aren't real, and they go back and forth like that for a little while. Susan says that Floyd Tibbetts wasn't really a violent type of person, and Ben responds saying that he thinks Floyd was all bundled up in an overcoat because of the sun hurting his skin. In other words, he's trying to say that he thinks Floyd might have been becoming a vampire, and it's not really clear who turned Floyd into a vampire, although if you look at it time-wise, it was either Danny Glick or Barlow, one of those. And then we go over to Floyd Tibbetts himself in the jail at the sheriff's office. Floyd hasn't been eating, and then to Noli's surprise, he turns out to be not sleeping, but actually dead. Then we go to two town drunks, Frank Boddins and Virgil Rathbun, and they are at the town dump. It's closed, and Dud Rogers is nowhere around, probably something to do with that whole conversation he had with Barlow in part 1. Ben goes to see Matt Burke and puts a cross around Matt's neck because they both are in the same hospital together. And then after that, we are following Bonnie Sawyer, who is waiting for Corey Bryant with her shirt off. She says her husband is out of town, and they start doing some stuff. But then Reggie Sawyer is not actually out of town. Someone tipped him off that Bryant and his wife had been sleeping together, so Reggie Sawyer interrupts them with a shotgun, and Corey pees his pants. So Reggie takes Corey into the other room and forces him to put the shotgun in his mouth, and then just kind of torments Corey for a little while until he fires the shotgun, only to reveal that it's not really loaded. Reggie tells Corey to get out of town, and Corey gets up and runs away. Then Reggie goes up to Bonnie, and the implication is that there was some domestic abuse that happened. Then, outside, Corey thinks about how he's going to go away to Boston and try to figure out his life and try to put the whole shotgun in my mouth, pee in my pants, humiliation thing behind him. And then he runs into a stranger who we later find out that his name is Barlow. So Barlow tells him how great America and Salem's Lot are because people hate each other with such enthusiasm. Offhand, Barlow mentions that he was buddies with Hubie Marsden by correspondence, and then Barlow says he will help Corey stay in town and get his vengeance on the selfish Reggie. And then he goes all vampire on Corey. Then we're over with Susan, who calls Ben in a panic and brings him up to date. Floyd's death and the McDougal baby's dead and all that kind of fun stuff. Floyd died of anemia, and Susan knows that he had high blood pressure before his death. Also, Carl Foreman, the guy who does the autopsies, is gone, along with Mike Ryerson's body. Ben tells Susan to get a crucifix and stay off the streets. He says he's getting out of the hospital the next day, and then at the morgue, the attendants have lost the bodies of Floyd Tibbetts and the little Randall McDougal baby. So then we close the chapter when Danny Glick comes to Mark Petrie's window. Glick asks Mark to let him in using his hypnosis vampire powers. And then Mark resists by reciting nursery rhymes, which I thought was interesting. I have a feeling that the implication isn't going to be that something holy or crucifixes are really going to be the how you deter evil, but it's really more your, like, whatever you believe in. Like, if you just have faith in something, it'll be able to defeat evil, if that makes sense. And so it kind of almost has a Pontypool vibe, if anyone watching has seen that. But he's reciting these nursery rhymes, and he's able to resist the vampire hypnosis. And then eventually Mark knows he's going to give in to his hypnosis, so he grabbed the toy crucifix from his monster graveyard. Mark lets Danny in, and at the last minute, he puts the cross against Danny's face. Danny screams and retreats back out the window, and Mark's dad comes up the stairs to ask what's going on, and because he's like the most badass kid ever, he just tells his dad it's all okay, and then just goes back to sleep. Like, that's fought off a vampire, but we're all good. Go to sleep, Dad. No need to worry. Just toughest kid in the universe. Anyway, so that's how that chapter ends. So then we have chapter 11, in which we are following Ben again. And Susan and Ben go to Matt's room in the hospital, where they all talk about vampires and such. Susan is still skeptical, but still they decide to proceed as if vampires are real anyway. Ben appoints Matt as researcher. Matt promises to get Loretta Starcher, the librarian, to bring him tons of books on vampires. They also decide to bring Jim Cody into their little ensemble, again, like Stephen King likes to do. He likes to have these big groups fighting these monsters, not really a solo individual. So they incorporate Matt Cody into the group, of courageous vampire hunters. Ben and Matt have thought better of just going to the Marsden house and confronting Straker, who they figure is not a vampire since he's out in the daytime, but is still an accomplice with the vampires in some way. Matt tells Ben and Susan to go to Father Callahan, and then Jimmy comes in and kicks Susan and Ben out. Jimmy comes down and tells Ben that he's free to go, and he also mentions that somebody stole the Tibbets and McDougal corpses, which freaks Ben and Susan out more than Jimmy thought it would. Then Ben and Susan tell him their suspicions and ask him to exhume Danny Glick. Jimmy talks about the limits of science and medicine and says eventually that he'll exhume Danny. So then Ben and Jimmy go to the Glick's house to ask for permission, but no one's home, because they're probably vampires now. Then Ben and Jimmy cross the road, and Pauline Dickens, the waitress, comes out and tells them that Mrs. Glick died and Tony Glick is at the hospital in shock. Pauline seems to think mysterious things are happening, and it's noted that she is donning her St. Christopher's medal. Ben and Jimmy decide to go out to the funeral home where Mrs. Glick has been taken. Jimmy knows the owner, Maury Green. At home, Susan decides to take action. She goes into a field and gets a fence post and turns it into a makeshift stake. She is off to the Marsden house, sneaking through the woods, and this seemingly does not go well. Susan sees a car leave and figures it's Straker going into town, and then someone puts a hand on her shoulder. But we don't know whose it is yet because of suspense and whatnot. Instead, we cut back over to the funeral home where Jimmy has convinced Maury Green to let them inspect the body of Mrs. Glick to see if she rises back from the dead. Though they didn't tell Maury that that was what they were trying to do. They wait, and just before sundown, Jimmy binds two tongue depressors together to form a cross and gets Ben to bless them. Mrs. Glick is resurrected at nightfall, calling for her son Danny. Ben holds her at bay with a cross, and Jimmy doubles around behind her and tries to grab her. Mrs. Glick turns and grabs Jimmy and bites him. Ben forces her away with the cross and shoves it in her face, where it burns her. Mrs. Glick backs up, cackles that their circle is now less by one, and then disappears. Jimmy is screaming because, he just got bit by a vampire, and he says he can feel the vampire juices working on him. Jimmy dumps an antiseptic on the wound and has Ben go give him a tetanus shot. Then Jimmy thinks he's better and hits Ben in the jaw as part of a cover story. Jimmy says they'll pretend that a guy came in and beat them both up and took the body. Hubert McCaslin, the county sheriff, is not particularly impressed with the story, but he doesn't have anything else to hold them for, so he lets them go. And then we end the chapter back at Ben's room in the boarding house, where he goes to sleep with the lights on and the tongue depressor crossed by his side, hoping that Susan is all right. But we don't know if she is until we roll into the next chapter. So chapter 12 is from the perspective of Mark. And so Mark is sneaking through the woods towards the Marsden house. He's got an ash stake for the vampire and a gun for Straker. So Mark came to the same conclusion that Straker isn't a vampire, but he's complicit. Mark sees Susan Norton with her own fence post stake, and Mark is unimpressed, thinking that that stake wouldn't kill anything. After Straker's car goes off, Mark comes up behind her and tells her not to scream. So it was Mark's hand earlier that was on her shoulder. So it's actually okay for now. Mark tells her about Danny Glick coming for him, and she doesn't believe him at first, but then she starts to come around. Mark and Susan team up and decide to break in and find the vampire and stake him. Mark and Susan both have crosses, and Mark tells Susan not to look in the vampire's eyes. He knows all about vampires from monster magazines, and we already established that information was going to come in handy with him earlier in part 1. So Mark and Susan break into the house through a window. Inside, they find a book in Latin. There's a picture of an eviscerated child in it. King sort of suggests through the narration that it is covered in human skin. Ugh. And then Mark and Susan see the cellar. Both are terrified, and they are about to go down there when Straker shows up and captures them, knocking Mark out. When Mark wakes up, the gun is gone. Straker taunts him and tells him after dark the vampire is going to come for him and Susan both. He ties Mark up in his room where Hugh B. Marsden hung himself. Mark uses a trick Harry Houdini used to use, and he flexed all of his muscles all at the same time while Straker was going about tying him up. And he did this so that later he could relax and slip out of the rope. So when Straker leaves, Mark takes his time and basically puts himself into a trance, moving very slowly, and eventually gets out of his ropes. It is now just about nighttime, though, when he is out of his ropes, and Mark has just enough time to loosen a leg of a cot to use as a weapon before Straker comes up the stairs. Mark hides behind the door and bashes Straker in the head when he comes in, knocking him down. Straker still manages to grab his ankle, and Mark smashes Straker's hand with the cot leg, breaking Straker's fingers. Mark stops at the cellar and calls down to Susan, but it's too late. She calls to him and then screams. Barlow tells Mark to come downstairs, and he almost does, but instead he runs back home where his parents are really, really angry at him for just being out. And then we end the chapter with Mark in his room when in the middle of the night, Susan, now being a vampire, comes to his window, but he drives her off with his cross. And then that brings us to the final chapter of part 2, chapter 13, and in this chapter we follow with Father Callahan. So Father Callahan comes to Matt Burke's hospital room and finds him reading books about vampires. Callahan, intrigued, listens to Matt, and Matt says he hasn't been able to get in touch with Ben, Jim Cody, or Susan Norton, whose parents are worried sick about her. Ben and Jimmy at the time were dealing with Mrs. Glick, and Susan was either in the middle of being or about to be captured. Callahan toys with the idea that Matt is suffering from sickbed dementia, but Matt convinces him to at least listen to his story anyway. When Matt's done, Callahan tells his own story about a friend who heard a story about an incubus. Matt asks Callahan to do some investigation, bringing holy water and the host, and Callahan says that is a very serious thing, but at the same time, so are vampires. So, yeah. Matt and Callahan talk about evil and about how Freud has replaced God and blah, 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 but Father Callahan really despises this. And so Callahan agrees to help against the vampire. And at first, he is exhilarated because he's getting the chance to fight the big evil that he always wanted. But then he is terrified. And that's the end of part 2. So, I loved this chapter. I still think that a bulk of the action is going to be taking place in part 3, but we saw the very rapid build of the vampires and how quickly the town got turned, and then we saw a couple of encounters with vampires that was very, very well written and very descriptive. And I really enjoyed this part. I can't wait to see how it concludes in part 3. Some predictions I have for part 3. So we know that Susan is now a vampire. I think that King is going to subvert expectations of following closely with the Dracula story, and I think just because of how the book opened, that Susan is not going to survive being a vampire. But we'll see how that plays out in part 3. If you have any predictions about what's going to happen in part 3, put them in the comments. Let me know what you think. And yeah, if you like this, I will be back next week where we will be discussing part 3. And then if you really liked this, I also go live 4 other nights a week at 7:30. So tomorrow I will be back for another installment of Weekend Deep End, which is just a half-hour deep dive into something I'm interested in. Then we do Music Monday, where I talk about different bands and make suggestions, talk about weird instruments, and it's a good time. Then we come back on Wednesday for Willpower Wednesday, which is a half-hour discussion about someone with a lot of or executing a crazy feat of willpower, hopefully to inspire myself and others to have more willpower. And then on Thursdays, we do Thoughtful Thursday, where we talk about a cool piece of tech, some crazy historical event, and a really smart person. So if any of those sound interesting to you, then come join me. And thank you so much for joining me tonight, and have a wonderful evening.